Hi, this is John Hall. Earlier this year, we launched a new podcast on the All About Beer channel. It's called One Iconic Beer, and it's hosted by Jeff Allworth. As the name suggests, the show is a deep dive into a beer that made an impact. It airs once a month, and this week, I'm glad to share a recent episode focused on Bass Ale. The next new episode releases on Monday, so head over to the All About Beer channel now, wherever you download shows, and subscribe today so you don't miss the new episode when it comes out. As always, if you like the work we do and want to see more of it or hear more of it, please visit allaboutbeer.com/support to learn how a few dollars can help fund our original journalism. You can reach me at johnhall@allaboutbeer.com. That's JOHNHOLL at allaboutbeer.com with suggestions or questions or anything else. And I'll be back next week with a brand new episode of Drink Beer, Think Beer. But for now, please enjoy this great episode of One Iconic Beer with Jeff Allworth.
It was basically the first big consumer brand. It was the first ever, the world's first ever multinational brand. That distinctive red triangle appears in so many, obviously, kind of the Folie bar at the Folie Bergère painting, but it appears in so many different places, and it was a symbol of quality. You wanted Bass Pale Ale wherever you were, and as you say, it went to North America. It went to Australia. It went all around the world when global brands really were not a thing. And it was pale, it was bitter, it was bright, it was sparkling, it was pale. It looked great in a glass, and it kind of swept all before it until Pilsner Lager came along about 50 years later and took over.
That's journalist Pete Brown discussing the country's most famous brewery and the subject of today's episode of One Iconic Beer. Today, Bass is a single beer brewed by a multinational giant, but it was at one time the world's biggest and most technologically advanced breweries. Founded in the 18th century, Bass has an incredible history. Eventually, the brewery's signature pale ale would become world famous before evolving into the modern cask ale we know today. In many ways, in telling the story of Bass, we're recounting the history of brewing in Britain over the last 2 centuries. To unpack this story, we're going to hear from Harry White, who started at Bass in their R&D department in 1977. He would go on to become Director of Quality Assurance in 1989, and he stayed with the company until 2007. Today, he's the chairman of the National Brewery Heritage Trust in Burton Upon Trent, his hometown. We're also going to hear from Pete Brown, one of the most celebrated beer writers in the world, and the author of, most recently, Tasting Notes, The Art and Science of Pairing Beer and Music. He's the author of over a dozen books, including Miracle Brew, one of the best books at explaining beer to a general audience, and one of my favorites. This podcast is hosted by All About Beer and myself, Jeff Allworth. I'm a writer and the author of books like The Beer Bible and The Secrets of Master Brewers. All About Beer magazine was founded nearly 50 years ago and is the most comprehensive source for beer information on the internet. Go to allaboutbeer.com to find more podcasts, beer news, insight, and opinion. But first, a word from the important partners who make this podcast possible.
This episode of the One Iconic Beer podcast is supported by RAR BSG, trusted supplier to brewers, distillers, and beverage makers across North America. From the barley field to your brewhouse, we're proud to support the people behind great beer with the ingredients, expertise, and service they depend on. Whether you're brewing the next great American double IPA or crafting an award-winning continental lager, RAR BSG provides the industry's finest quality, selection, and support. Behind every great, or even iconic, pint, there is a partner who knows what it takes to make it happen. RAR BSG is proud to keep the beer flowing with you.
Tired of inconsistent fermentations and off flavors in your beer? It's time to strike back with Yeast Lightning Nutrient from Escarpment Labs. Unlike generic nutrients, Yeast Lightning is a balanced blend containing bioavailable zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins designed specifically for beer yeast. It's been proven to shorten fermentation times and improve final beer flavor. Plus, it helps you get more generations out of your yeast, saving you money on every batch. Whether it's a dry hopped IPA or a crisp lager, give your yeast the fuel that they actually need. Order your first pack today by emailing sales@escarpmentlabs.com. Mention the All About Beer podcast to get free shipping on your first order.
Britain in the late 18th century was a really exciting time for brewing. We were in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and the development of breweries kind of went hand in hand with that. We were the first country to industrialize. And although this doesn't get taught in school at all, the brewers were kind of the innovators with a lot of the new technologies, with things like steam power, hydrometers, microscopes, bit early for microscopes, but yeah, all this stuff was going on. And so brewing was kind of striding ahead in a really exciting way.
That's Pete Brown giving us an overview of the moment Bass entered the stage when it was founded in 1777. At the time, its West Midlands home of Burton upon Trent was a small town on the periphery of brewing. This period marked the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and over the next 100 years, brewing would go through a massive technological shift. Nearly all of it would happen first in Britain, and the changes started with London's breweries south of Burton.
Porter was the first industrial beer. Before that, a lot of pubs brewed their own beer, and then porter really benefited from economies of scale, and so it became cheaper for brewers for pubs to buy beer rather than brew it themselves. So porter became this huge beer, the beer of the Industrial Revolution. Burton was slightly different. So porter was very much focused on London. Everybody brewed porter. Brewers in Burton brewed porter. But Burton had a reputation for brewing beers that travelled really well. It's kind of strange for a small landlocked town. It was you could get beers to the coast by the mid 18th century after the navigation opened up the river. But everyone just knew that Burton beers travelled really well and stored and kept very well for a long time. And it wouldn't be until the late 19th century that people figured out why. And it was all because of the water. The water around Burton on Trent is really hard, very, very high in sulfates. And if you're making hoppy beer, which you do if you want to make a beer that's going to store for a while, this kind of high sulfate water just really made that beer sing. So you get recipes that were brewed in London, you brew exactly the same beer in Burton with the same ingredients, and it just tastes better.
In the early days, water characterized a Burton beer, but soon a new technology arrived that changed the way they looked.
Yeah, so there was a lot of different technologies that went into it. I guess the key one was a breakthrough in malting technology. At one point, we were still malting barley over wood fires or hay, and you're getting that smoky taint to it. In the 17th century, we invented coke. It's kind of basically coal with the gases burnt out of it. And that allowed you to do very precise temperature control on malting. And that's when we get pale malt. And that revolutionizes everything. And so pale ale becomes popular after that. The second key technology was affordable glassware. So around the 1850s, taxes on glass are drastically reduced. And so people start to drink from glassware instead of pewter tankards. And this beautiful shining pale ale, it becomes incredibly fashionable because of that. And pale ale became the drink of Victorian society because it looked great in a glass.
The new malting techniques and the hop-friendly hard water caused Burton's beer to evolve. And these new pale bitter beers would serve a growing British Empire that would soon send them around the world.
Burton originally was famous for Burton brown ale. This is the stuff that was going to the Baltic and to Russia. It was sweet nut brown ale, and it was very kind of the only thing that was being brewed then. Then pale ale came in from London, and the legend is. I mean, I've not looked into this too deeply because I just think it's too perfect. I don't want to find out that it's not true. But the legend has it that the chairman of the East India Company fell out with this brewer Hodgson in London. And so he took Hodgson's beer up to Burton and said to Samuel Alsop and said, "Do you think you can brew this?" And he said, "Yeah, I could, but why would you want me to?" And he says, "Well, just give it a try." And so Alsop's beer goes to India and completely blows Hodgson out of the water. We now know why. It's because the recipe suited Burton water way better than it suited London water. But Hodgson was kind of out of the market within a few years. Then Bass came in and eventually very quickly became bigger than Allsop. So this was pale ale. At first, it wasn't called India Pale Ale. India Pale Ale kind of crops up as a name in the early 1830s. And this is if you're a civilian, like a civil servant basically, and you went to India and worked for the East India Company, you could make your fortune in about 3 years. And then you came back to Britain, a very rich person. And India had a real hold over British people who'd been out there and made their fortune. They came back a lot with Indian wives, Indian fashions, Indian clothes. And so adverts begin to appear in the newspapers for India Pale Ale. This is the beer that you had when you were out there in India. Now you can have it at home. And it kind of took off in a big way from sort of the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s.
Before we get too far into the history, let's bring Harry White into the conversation. He helps us understand what that hard water did to the beer and how central it was to Burton's breweries.
It had that nose to it, and that's partly sulfur. It's not just molten hot, because you've got a few hundred parts per million of sulfate there, which is coming through, and you've got yeast, which doesn't all, it's not chilled, it's not filtered rather. So even though the beer is bright, there's still some yeast character there. And it's a bit like walking into a fermenting room, an open fermenting. You get that smell. I've told before about the smell in High Street of boiling words, but the smell of going into a fermenting room of yeast and CO2, and a fair amount of alcohol. It does. So the Burton snatch was ill-defined, not controlled. It was a mix of perhaps too much yeast count on it at sometimes, but it characterised the beer and it made it special and it made it very, very drinkable. And going out with the engineers, some of them did a very, very good job in a huge long wheelbase Land Rover, going around checking on the wells at least once a week. And there were, in those days, there'd be over a dozen wells and boreholes. The wells are about 30 foot down. The boreholes could go down 300 foot, and they just spread out from the centre of town. As brewing took off in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, they just had to keep looking for more and more water, and it's still all there. This is what I think I keep reminding the council and the people I'm trying to work with on this heritage centre. It's all hidden in plain sight, if you like. If you know where you're looking, that's a well hole. That's a well house. That's a well house. And there's still about 2 or 3 dozen around town, and out on some of the farms just south of town. And the water distribution systems are all there. If you've ever seen a map of London Underground, it's a bit like that. It's the distribution system. So it's there. You've got to be very careful when you start to dig up the roads or anywhere in Burton, because the chances, if you don't know what you're doing, you'll hit a water main, and they're big. They're like 2 foot diameter. We're talking serious volumes of water. And yes, it was very, it was known from the 18th century, in fact, early 1700, that Burton's beers were well known and recognised, even as far down as London those days, and it was put down to what was called the minerality of the water, and it had an effect, and it does. I mean, it's primarily sulfates and calciums, some chloride there as well, and the salts of the calcium, but it's calcium sulfate, which is gypsum in the main, and it affects, I don't know how much brewing you know up here, but it affects the pH from mashing in onwards. So it optimizes all the metabolic reactions you want to take place in the mash tun and whatever, and we're boiling. So it affects the pH of the wort and the beer, and it affects the flavour. People to taste water that's got a few hundred parts per million of sulfate in, compared with distilled water, it's bitter. It's bitter and it's dry. And that they're 2 characteristic flavours of Burton beers. And that was recognised and capitalised on in a big way.
All right, back to our history. In the 19th century, pale ales started becoming popular, but these weren't the bitters you find on cask now. They were aged beers, brewed with a bitter hop load that needed to sit for months to ripen. Pete described them for us.
One of the big train stations in London, St Pancras Station, was the main line. It's still the main line. If you're going to go from Burton on Trent down to London by train, that's the station you go into. That station was custom built to store hogsheads of IPA in the cellar in the Undercroft. And if the beer didn't go to India on its 6-month sea journey, it sat and aged for a year in these cellars, like under St Pancras and other places. So it was about the aging, it was about the conditioning, and a lot of contemporary accounts talk about the beer being ripe, or the beer not being ripe yet. And I'm obsessed with this idea of what the ripe beer must have tasted like and what unripe beer must have tasted like. We did occasionally use American hops, and you get people writing about the disagreeable aroma of blackcurrant leaf that American hops have. So it really wasn't about the aromatics. It was about the bitterness, and it was about the balance and the blend of it.
And what did this 19th century pale ale taste like?
There's a lot of speculation. One of the big speculations is whether there would have been any Brett character to it. Now, we're talking about before Pasteur, before pasteurization, before microbiology. So I think it would have been inevitable that there would have been some kind of Brett character to it. We know for a fact that Brett was a big feature in porter, because Brettanomyces, British fungus, it was discovered in porter breweries a few years later. So I think it probably had a bit of a Brett character. Like I say, no kind of real hop aroma. I think a firm malty base. And I think, yeah, with a bit of, and I think that maybe that Brett character would have given it that champagne edge that got it, which meant that it got all those champagne comparisons as well. So I think it would have been an amazing beer.
You may be scratching your head about this. Bass isn't a strong, aged, vinous beer today. What happened? Pete Brown describes Bass's evolution.
Yeah, so it evolved quite a lot, really. Two big things happened. One is a lot more people in Britain got jobs that were not just manual. And so right until the early 20th century, people were drinking 7-8 pints of beer a day while they were working. Suddenly you're a clerk in an office and you can't really do that. So the strength of beer had to come down. And the tax on beer in the 1860s was revised, and beer became taxed on its ABV, on its strength. And so immediately what we see is a drop in the average ABV of a pint of beer from about 7-8% to about 4%. And then World War I happened, scarcity of raw materials, and also kind of measures against factory workers being drunk. So the strength of beer came down to less than 3%. And it stayed like that for most of the 20th century. So, we have Green King IPA here at the moment, which is a big brand. A lot of beer nerds go, that's not a proper IPA, that's not a real IPA because it's only 3.6%. When it was first brewed in 1928, that was the average strength of an IPA. You wouldn't, if you could bring a brewer from the 1920s forward in time now and say, describe me an IPA, they'd describe you this 3.6%, not very hoppy, quite bland beer. So Bass becomes, we get the invention of real ale. So we get the hand pumps on the bar, and instead of being aged, beer is served fresh. So it's still live, it's still got yeast working in it. We get Pasteur, we get the microscope. We understand how that yeast is the primary agent of fermentation for the first time in the 1870s. And so we get this kind of living, breathing real ale. And Bass was just beloved, really. It was nice and bitter. There's a quality in the water, a slightly sulphurous quality in some of the Burton water that became known as the Burton Snatch. And so that was kind of a characteristic of Bass. And it was just one of the first beers to be loved all across the UK. Where most beers were very, very much regional, Bass was pretty much the first national brand.
Now that we've covered the broad contours of Bass's long history, let's drop into Burton with Harry White as he found it when he arrived in the 1970s.
I joined a company called Bass Charrington. It had been formed from the merger of Bass in Burton, which in fact had merged with Mitchell and Butlers in Birmingham. So I was joining a National Brewing Company, still relatively newly formed. It was still just about 10 years old, but if you know anything about how companies merge, it all sounds and looks good on paper, but the reality is something different. People have to learn to work with one another. Organisations are sorted out and what have you. So I joined Bass Charrington. I was based in Burton in the R&D department in Burton High Street, which was right next, very close by the breweries. Bass had a fair amount of acreage in Burton at that time, distribution networks, maltings and breweries. But the company was made up of 13 breweries across the UK, as well as three maltings, and had a national distribution operation. So it was a big company. And I joined, seeing your first notes, you say, I joined in January 77. The UK brewing industry had just had its best ever year probably since the Second World War, obviously before the Second World War. 76 was a very hot summer in the UK. And I remember going to a conference down in Cambridge with the Institute of Brewing, and driving back. I was still at the Research Foundation in the summer of 76. We were driving back through London to get down to Surrey, and we were driving into pubs and trying to get a beer. And there was big notices up in pub car parks saying no beer, sold out. The only ones that had beer were Charrington's pubs, and Charrington was still selling beer. Because it had got this brand new operation in Runcorn, or Bass Charrington, which was brewing 24/7, 7 days a week, 24 hours, shift brewing. No one had done that in the UK before. It was new, and they kept the pubs supplied with beer, and that was quite a novelty, and it seemed to be the sign of things to come. So the company had a very good year. And when I joined Burton in 1st of January, it was like Burton was a bit like Sodom and Gomorrah, really. It was still recovering from the biggest Christmas party they'd thrown in years. So that was my introduction to Burton and to Bass. The company was on a high.
Burton was still a bustling city then.
There were still 4 or 5 breweries. There was Bass, there was Allied Breweries, which was the old Ann Cooper Old Soap. There was Marston's, which was a family-owned independent brewing operation. There was Everard's. So there were 4 brewers. There weren't any micro brewers at the time. 4 brewers, big distribution centre, wagons leaving, thronging the streets every 7 days a week with beer going out. The brewers all met up. That's practicing brewers would meet up once a month formally for something called the PDPU, which was the payday piss up, and they all got paid on one Thursday in the month. And so there was a lot of camaraderie and a lot of bonhomie, and the people I worked for in Bath all did seem to enjoy a beer. It seemed to be part of it was part of the culture, particularly in Burton High Street. So it was a thriving town, from my perception as kind of a middle manager in Bath, and you were joining a major company that loved what it was doing, and people enjoyed what they were doing, and they were good at it because the beers were good.
When we come back, we're going to hear what Bass looked like in the 1970s, but first, this message.
This episode of the One Iconic Beer podcast is supported by RAR BSG, trusted supplier to brewers, distillers, and beverage makers across North America. From the barley field to your brew house, we're proud to support the people behind great beer with the ingredients, expertise, and service they depend on. Whether you're brewing the next great American double IPA or crafting an award-winning continental lager, RAR BSG provides the industry's finest quality, selection, and support. Behind every great, or even iconic, pint, there is a partner who knows what it takes to make it happen. RAR BSG is proud to keep the beer flowing with you.
Tired of inconsistent fermentations and off flavors in your beer? It's time to strike back with Yeast Lightning Nutrient from Escarpment Labs. Unlike generic nutrients, Yeast Lightning is a balanced blend containing bioavailable zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins designed specifically for beer yeast. It's been proven to shorten fermentation times and improve final beer flavor. Plus, it helps you get more generations out of your yeast, saving you money on every batch. Whether it's a dry hopped IPA or a crisp lager, give your yeast the fuel that they actually need. Order your first pack today by emailing sales@escarpmentlabs.com. Mention the All About Beer podcast to get free shipping on your first order.
All right, let's get back to our story. In the 19th century, big steam-powered breweries started to dot the British landscape. They were the most technologically advanced breweries at the time, and they contained many of the ornate architectural features of the era. And they were built to last.
There was a good few acres because there was a huge malting complex outside, just outside Shobnall, and that was still kind of a Victorian structure. You can see your kind of drawings of it, a great row of maybe a dozen huge malt houses. Large breweries, and then there was another malt house. There were still malt houses around town, and people don't realise that the maltings operation, it took up a fair amount of acreage and ground space, and that was still, I won't say it was still a fairly manual operation, was malting, and a lot of people were employed there, so they were awe-inspiring as you went in. Marble and just the sheer scale. Well, it's typical Victorian, not typical, but it's Victorian England and Victorian architecture at its best. I think it was meant to humble and impress suppliers when they came in knocking on the doors. So the old brewery was closed. Well, the site was still there, and then there was walking up the stairs. There was number two brewery, which had been built in 1860s and was called the New Brewery. That's where the draft bass was brewed, which is what you want to talk about. So number two, an impressive operation, and linked by transfer mains over the town across the road into what had been the Middle Brewery. So Bass had three breweries: the Old Brewery, the New Brewery, the Middle Brewery. Middle Brewery was closed, but I'll come on to it because that was where all the beer conditioning took place. And at the side of number two brewery, they built Surprise number one brewery. It's called number one because it was just built in the early 70s, and that was on the site of an old maltings, the Dowley Maltings. And number one brewery had a European, I think it was Swiss brew house, and it was brewing lager. And that was all new. That's the sign of things to come. A lager brewery in Burton on Trent, at the side of number two brewery, the old brewery. So that was the layout, and then there was distribution depots, and also, if you want the layout, everything was still very much steam driven, and there were boiler houses all over the place. Every street corner, boiler houses and chimneys, and great piles of coal everywhere. So it was, it wasn't quite Victorian, but it hadn't moved on. There was none of the. It was all still very, very manual and driven by steam.
As we learned from Pete, Britain shifted away from the aged beers to fresh cask ales of the 20th century. Bass was one of the national leaders in cask ale, much of it feeding their empire of pubs around the country. It was no longer the largest brewer in the world, but it was big, and it impressed a young Harry White. I asked him to take us on a tour of the brewery, and he started with the on-site maltings, where the brewery prepared the barley for brewing.
When I first started, there was 4 maltings there, yeah. Lots of photos there. The 70s, still being replaced by salad in boxes. If you know what they are, pneumatic, automated screws would turning the grain. Very big maltings at Shomwell. When I retired, we were still malting. Well, we were doing 10 million barrels of beer a year. We had about 200,000 tons of barley coming in. So we had it was a big operation. Yeah, 200,000 tons a year we'd buy. Not just for Burton, there were maltings in Scotland, and there was one in Yorkshire until the 1990s. If you're going to brew beer on a big scale and be serious about it, you need control of your primary raw material. Plus, you've got control of the water, right? So next, the barley. So we bought barley, not malt. We had some coloured malts and specialty malts, but our main malts were made in our own maltings. and so we were buying barley, and we bought through the Institute of Brewing approved list of barley varieties.
Harry continues, describing the hops Bass used.
With hops, yeah. Again, yes, there were British varieties. There were no, we had 13 breweries. You could use any hops you wanted, so long as they were either North Down or Challenger. And that's what we used, particularly. North Down and Challenger 50-50. The thing is that system worked well enough until we ended up about a very high percentage of the UK North Down crop was going to Bass, and it became commercially not viable to do that. We need to look at other varieties.
What about the brew house itself? They had 3 of them. The one on which they made their classic Bass cask ale was over 100 years old.
Okay. Well, it was a big building, so built in the 1860s, and it took them 2 years to knock it down in the early 80s. These things were built to last. I remember my morning. I started in the brew house, 6 o'clock one morning. Met the lads on the mash tun half there. He got 6 mash tuns, three pairs. And they were traditional Victorian infusion mash tuns, so lots of brass and lots of wood. Again, it's the smell in a mash tun of wet grain and sugars, and then sparge in it all. So you got lots of steam and lots of water and lots of smell. It's a smell that is a memory evoking, and you're surrounded. With it's all brick built, and lots of wood, lots of pine. But getting beer down from running off a mash tun into an underback, pumping it up to the coppers. So your first words were going on to the higher gravity beers, and your more running beers were on the second words, and running into the coppers and getting up to volume in the copper and then boiling. What were I can't remember those coppers. Originally, they were coal fired. Certainly in the old brewery, they were coal fired. You could still see where the fires were underneath. It all been bricked up. I'll tell you something. And they were given a good vigorous boil. I'll tell you one thing. I was talking earlier about walking down Burton High Street and the smell. The Bass number 1, which is a high gravity and 1100 growth, it was boiled for 12 hours. It was a shift and a half. Now, can you imagine it was doing that these days? Because it's all driven by energy and money. But yeah, to boil a wort for 12 hours, boy, did you know about that. And then, and that's the thing. The processing was, which just gave the beer its unique characteristics and flavour.
If anything in a Burton brewery rivaled the water, it was an old piece of early industrial equipment called a Burton Union set. Harry will describe that in a moment, but first he discusses how Bass cooled the wort and started the fermentation process.
So the brew house, quite a complex operation, and it would take a shift to run a normal beer off from mashing in through the copper, paraflow. In number 2 brewery, then, there was still a cool ship. If you know where a cool ship is, huge, expansive brewery. Wasn't used. We're on paraflows, but they've never taken the old one out. So that was still there. And then the shift you'd start to run off from the paraflows into open fermenters, either squares or rounds. And to go into that room, as I was describing, is the smell of wort and yeast going in. Pitch them on transfer into the FVs, so there were these big rooms full of squares and rounds, and that's how people talk about the union system. I'm sure you're going to hear about that, but the cool worts didn't go straight into the union cells. They went into open vessels first and were pitched, and they'd spend the first 36 hours there until they were really really vigorous. They were really vigorous fermenting. Then you run them down to union set, which is easier said than done because it's pretty active stuff. It's fermenting. It's fermenting well, and again you got the smell of CO2. Um, so I don't know if you're giving you a picture of the brew house. It was old and a bit of a rabbit warren, really. And lots of guys running around doing various jobs, mostly about pumping and getting spent grains out and all that. But very, very memorable experience.
After the beer had fermented for 12 to 24 hours, it would proceed onward to a union set. Developed in the late 1800s, this equipment was used to finish fermentation and clarification. By the late 1970s, only Marston's and Bass still had a union set. Here's Harry describing it.
I think it started in about the 1820s in the north of England, actually, in Liverpool. There's some stories that say it's in Liverpool. The Walker, there was a brewery in again, they were Liverpudlians or Mancunians, came down to Burton and they started it. But I seem to think John Gretton introduced it to Bass in the 1830s, and it quickly became like it's the Burton Union. So whatever its origins, and it became known as the Burton Union system because it just became synonymous with the town. So it was, but yeah, the union sets were. You've seen pictures, I suppose, and we've got one, the remaining one, on site here in Burton, in a bit of a sad state at the moment, but it's going to cost a lot to put it right. But the sets that we were used to is called a double set. It's 52 casks, so it's 3 barrels, 100 next barrel gallons in each butt, and so there's 50 odd of them. So you got 100. You got a lot of work. I couldn't have to do the sums. I mean, they would take you'd take a couple of sets to fill up a brew length. They were running about 400 barrels, something like that. So say it's about 36 hours when fermentations in the open squares, rounds, whatever, are really at their most active, and you've got most yeast growth. Then you ton them down. Complex transfer mains into a union set, which have got 2 huge troughs separated by a cross trough in the middle, so right angles to the main trough, and underneath the main troughs is 2 rows of 26 each butts, so a line of 13, 13, 13, 13, and a cross trough. And it's all connected by, and I'm talking the late 70s, with the best technology in the world. Not everything always went according to plan. If you've seen pictures, they are a microbiologist, either a dream or a nightmare. Microbiologist's dream and a brewer's nightmare. Keeping it clean and hygienic was a constant battle at the end of the day. That's another story. I mean, Burton beers from the 19th, they were known for their bitterness, high bitterness level, which helped with the microbiological stability and helped while they were travelling. But sulfates can are very bitter in their own right. So you need the time for them to interact and balance out with one another. In the 19th century, that happened while they were en route to India. What better way of conditioning a beer than put it in the hold of a ship and ship it halfway around the world? You get all the interactions and the mixing, and the beer arrived, tasted pretty good. I guess most things taste pretty good if you're slaving away in a climate like India, but whatever. So it's a subtle mix of various things coming together over time, and that, I think, was the essence of the union set, and the quality of the yeast that was left in the top trough was could be squeegeed out, and that will be what will be used for pitching on next time around. So there's a bit of a picture for you.
British drinkers had managed to avoid falling in love with pale lagers for a full century after the rest of the world did. Right through the 1970s and into the 80s, Britain still drank a majority of beer in pubs, and most of it was cask ale, including a lot of draft Bass.
So there's two throughout most of the 20th century. You basically look essentially. I'm oversimplifying, but you've got two beer styles. You've got mild and bitter, and mild is not hoppy, and bitter is hoppy, and you take your pick, or you might have a half and half. And Bass just did really well. It's that thing that the key to British cask ale is that it has so the live conditioning. It just has a level of subtlety and depth that few other beers do, and at a relatively low ABV, it just really, really delivers. And then that kind of hoppy bitterness is quite moreish. It just keeps you wanting to drink. It's got a slight nuttiness to it. It's just a real kind of rounded, satisfying drink that you can drink quite a lot of, and you want to drink quite a lot of.
But things were changing. In 1980, 3 out of every 4 beers sold in Britain was an ale like Bass's. By the turn of the century, that figure had roughly fallen in half, and ale accounted for less than 40% of the beer sold. How did this happen? Well, the success of the Big Six, of which Bass was a charter member, had a lot to do with it. Pete Brown explains.
Yeah, in the late 19th century, Bass was the biggest brewery in the world. It was like I said, it was the first multinational brand, the first global brand, if you like. It was famously the first trademark in the UK, second trademark in the world after Krupp's in Germany. And it was kind of all conquering. But then Britain was so invested in pale ale, we didn't see the threat from Pilsner Lager. And so what you get when you look at things like the Calcutta Gazette is you'd get classified ads for Bass, and then by about 1906 you got full page ads for Beck's Lager. And so Lager kind of took, if Bass was light, pale, refreshing, Lager was even more light, pale, refreshing. And the reason that we shipped beer to India in the first place was because you couldn't brew over there because of refrigeration. Without refrigeration, you couldn't brew in India. So suddenly we got refrigeration, we got refrigerated travel, and storage. And so Bass kind of loses its shine around the world. But it remains very, very popular in the UK. We carry on drinking pale ale when everybody else turns to lager. And then there's an interesting kind of pivot in the middle of the 20th century. At the end of the 19th century, beer consumption peaked in sort of the 1880s. And brewers responded to that by buying up the pubs that sold their beer. They all floated on the stock exchange. Raised a huge amount of cash, and they bought all the pubs. So they were tied pubs. So you get Bass in Bass pubs, you get Whitbread in Whitbread pubs, and so on. And so from the 50s to the late 60s, you get this incredible consolidation, really, really rapid. And by 1969, we basically got 6 breweries in the UK who own about 85% of the market. And the biggest of them is Bass Charrington.
The kind of beer we drink is affected by many factors: process and ingredients, local tastes, and history, of course. But one factor people often overlook are laws, which can have a radical effect on beer. That was certainly the case in Britain.
We had this dreadful piece of legislation called the Beer Orders that came in 1989, and that was designed to break the vertical integration of the breweries owning the pubs. And the idea was that that breweries would sell off their pubs. What actually happened was they sold off their breweries. Because there was more money in the pubs than there was in the breweries. And so we ended up, within 10 years of the beer orders being passed, we ended up with all those big 6 breweries that used to exist after that consolidation. None of them were British owned. So our entire beer production in this country is now owned by Brazilians and Belgians and Americans. And there was a real mess with Bass. So let me try and get this straight. Yes, Interbrew bought Bass, the brewery. Now, in Burton on Trent, Bass seriously must own about 30% of the land in Burton on Trent. Everywhere you went, you saw that distinctive red triangle above buildings. The Monopolies and Mergers Commission said that this was too big, that Interbrew couldn't own all this. So they sold the Bass Brewery and all its brands to what is now Molson Coors, but kept the Bass brand. So they've completely lost its heritage, its home, but they've still got the brand. I remember reading something from AB InBev saying, we don't understand ale. We're not ale brewers. We've got no heritage of it. So we couldn't give a crap about it, really. And they just let it wither. And the worst thing was, there were lots of brewers going, well, Bass is like the most famous British beer ever. If you don't want it, can we have it? And AB InBev went, no, we don't want it, but you can't have it either. And so it just withered. It just disappeared from pubs. It had no marketing support. You still saw it every now and again. It's like sighting a rare bird in the wild when you did. But they vandalized it basically.
How did the new law and gradual shift away from cask ale affect Bass?
Yeah, okay. Well, the recipe didn't really change. There's no fundamental changes, except I know well, I know the liquor treatment isn't anything now like what it used to be, and that changed in the early 2000s. Because I know the head brewer of when we if I say we, I'm talking about the old Bass company that I work for. Okay, we lost the brand at the end of 2000 to Interbrew. They were allowed to keep it, and they kept it being brewed in Burton for the first 5 years. They saw value in being able to say it's still brewed in Burton. Yeah, it was, and then they transferred it. They did a deal with Marston's, as it was then for them to brew it. It seems strange for us, Bass, to be brewing Bass under license to somebody else. And and when it did go to Marston, I remember I knew the head brewer there recently well, having quite a conversation with him saying it's not the same as it was. And it transpired that he said the liquor treatment is nowhere near. So, but that's people altering beers to suit modern marketing or what they perceive to be what the current consumers want. It was a challenge for the beginning. So I know the liquor treatment there, but other than that, I think the raw materials changed. The fundamental change in Bass in 1982 when we Bass were new number two brewery was going to close, he would have to go to cylinder conicals. And I remember there was lots of trials being done with brewing Bass, cask Bass in cylinder conical fermenting vessels. And the major change was dropping G1 and concentration on G2. Well, you can get away with it. You still produce a drinkable beer, a decent beer, a good beer. But you're trying to square a circle. You lose something without a doubt. You lose. All right, 90% of the time it's just fine. Well, that 10% of the time when it can be absolute nectar, you kind of lose that.
In 2000, Interbrew acquired what remained of Bass and later sold it to Coors. The old brewery shut down and Bass became an orphaned brand overseen by a large international brewery. For many beers, that would mean the end of the road, and indeed, for years, sighting of Bass nearly vanished. But then, amazingly, it started to make a comeback.
So there's a guy at AB InBev who happens to be a real ale fan, who happened to kind of have Bass at the bottom of his list of brands that he was responsible for, and he said, "What if we bring this back?" And before this happened, Bass is now brewed under contract by Carlsberg in Burton on Trent. This is really mysterious because if anyone gives less of a shit about cask ale than AB InBev do, it's Carlsberg. they're the biggest cask ale brewer in the world, and they are destroying it as fast as they can. But there's some.
Can I just interrupt you and have you explain why Carlsberg is brewing it in Burton?
Yes, this is a big. Yeah, let's rewind. So because AB InBev don't understand cask ale and have no interest in it, they contracted out the brewing of Bass to Marston's, which was the other big brewer in Burton. Marston's went into a joint venture with Carlsberg. Carlsberg 2 years ago bought them out of that, so the Marston's disappeared from the name. It's now just Carlsberg. They own, because of a previous strategy that Marston's had of acquiring cask ale brands around the country, Carlsberg suddenly found themselves the biggest brewer of cask ale in the world. and they have no interest in it whatsoever. So they're axing brands day after day. At least 15 well-loved cask ale brands are now no more. That they've just been axed, but they're still brewing Bass for AB InBev. And I've asked about this, and they won't talk to me about it. But clearly, within the sort of deep dark corridors of Carlsberg, there's someone who really likes Bass, who's responsible for brewing it. So they're not getting paid any money. They're not getting. They've got no reason to put their heart and soul into it. But I'd say about 4 years ago, people on social media started to go, "Oh, I've just found a pint of Bass in my local, and you know what? It's amazing. It's way better than it was." So this mysterious contract brewer has basically put everything into making Bass great again. This word of mouth thing spread that, hey, if you see Bass, it's cracking. It's really fantastic. You must buy one. And so then this guy, AB InBev, kind of gets wind of this and says, okay, why don't we put a bit of promotional support behind it again then? And so pubs start to get visits from AB InBev salesmen. And it's like, oh, here's the latest thing on Budweiser. Oh, and by the way, here's an offer on Draft Bass if you want this. And so it's relaunched. They're doing the right thing by it. They're treating it like a premium core brand. They're putting marketing support behind it, and whoever this person is who's brewing it is brewing great beer. So it's this wonderful good news story that, in a really, really unlikely way, Draft Bass is back to its best.
At the moment, Bass is enjoying a renaissance. In addition to some support within the brewery, a grassroots campaign helped to buoy Bass, which is now starting to pop up around the UK. At last count, it was available on draft in 1,000 pubs and restaurants. Harry White demurred when I asked what he thought about the current iteration. It may not live up to that beer that came out of an old Victorian brewery and passed through a Burton Union set. But P. Brown is still a fan, and we'll give him the last word.
So, in the north of England, cask beer is served with a sparkler. So a little thing that goes over the end of the pump with some tiny holes in it, and it creates this kind of creamy, smooth texture. In the south, we don't do that. Burton on Trent is no man's land. It's between the north and the south. You might get sparkler, you might not get sparkler. It depends what day it is and what pub you're in. But a good pint of Draft Bass is served through a sparkler. It comes out creamy. It's got this surge to it. It's the first sip, you get a kind of slight fruitiness, this wonderful smooth texture, and then this assertive bitterness at the end, but with this kind of caramel malt in the middle of the palate. And it is one of those beers where you're just getting into it, and then your glass is empty, and you think, how did that happen? It's that insane drinkability that a really, really, really great cask ale has.
My thanks to Harry White and Pete Brown for joining us to tell this story. This show is produced by All About Beer and was edited by John Paul. Visit us online at allaboutbeer.com, where you'll find a trove of wonderful information about all things beery. And please follow us on @allaboutbeer on social media. Our music was performed by Anastasia Chubarova, whom you can find on Pixabay. I'm Jeff Allworth. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one iconic beer.
This episode of the One Iconic Beer podcast is supported by RAR BSG, trusted supplier to brewers, distillers, and beverage makers across North America. From the barley field to your brew house, we're proud to support the people behind great beer with the ingredients, expertise, and service they depend on. Whether you're brewing the next great American double IPA or crafting an award-winning continental lager, RAR BSG provides the industry's finest quality, selection, and support. Behind every great, or even iconic, pint, there is a partner who knows what it takes to make it happen. RAR BSG is proud to keep the beer flowing with you.
Tired of inconsistent fermentations and off flavors in your beer? It's time to strike back with Yeast Lightning Nutrient from Escarpment Labs. Unlike generic nutrients, Yeast Lightning is a balanced blend containing bioavailable zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins designed specifically for beer yeast. It's been proven to shorten fermentation times and improve final beer flavor. Plus, it helps you get more generations out of your yeast, saving you money on every batch. Whether it's a dry hopped IPA or a crisp lager, give your yeast the fuel that they actually need. Order your first pack today by emailing sales@escarpmentlabs.com. Mention the All About Beer podcast to get free shipping on your first order.